we are so honored to be, because tonight's event, everything else pales in comparison with tonight's event. And we particularly, for many reasons, book, conversation partner, and also co-host. And I'd like to introduce Kim Wilson of the Jane Austen Society of North American Wisconsin Region. And she is also the author of 3 books about Jane Austen, if I may, In the Garden with Jane Austen, Tea with Jane Austen, and At Home with Jane Austen. And here she is. Hello, Kim.
Well, hi, Daniel. And I want to say how excited the Jane Austen Society, the local chapter or region Wisconsin is to be co-hosting this. We are so thrilled to be a part of anything with Paula Byrne. And as you probably already know, she's not only an expert on Barbara Pym and many other people, including Marlene Dietrich, I found out, but she is also a noted Jane Austen scholar who is very popular with JASNA members. And so if you don't know what JASNA is, we're a literary society. And we're dedicated to, obviously, the enjoyment and appreciation of Jane Austen, her works, her life, basically her genius. We have over 5,000 members just in the US and Canada alone, and a dozen other countries as well. So if you're interested in joining JASNA and meeting with us to talk about Jane Austen, you can visit the national website, which is jasna.org, or you can check out the Wisconsin website to see what our local members do. And if you'd like to join, then that is jasnawi.org. So thank you again, Daniel, for inviting us.
I will put the link in the chat space so folks can click on it and it'll open in another window that you can visit at length later. For tonight's event, I wanted to let folks know that we will be taking questions. We're going to ask that you put your questions in the Q&A app on Zoom so that Bill can see right away how many questions there are. If you send a question to the chat instead, I'll write back to you and ask you to repost it. But we'd love for you to comment in chat. Please tell us where you're from, maybe your favorite Barbara Pym novel, whatever you like. And with that said, allow me to introduce tonight's author and conversation partner. Paula Byrne is the author of The Adventures of Miss Barbara Pym, and the book came out in Great Britain last year, and among her most starving and voracious of Barbara Pym fans, I've got to say, thought, when is it coming out in the United States? Some people actually bought copies overseas. Some probably traveled overseas to buy a copy. We're so excited to say that the book officially came out in the United States from Harper 360 yesterday. The book is already getting some really wonderful write-ups, including 5 pages in the New Yorker, a review in the Wall Street Journal, a recommendation from the wonderful Alexander McCall Smith in the same Wall Street Journal. And it is not in print yet, I don't believe, but the New York Times just posted their review from Matthew Schneier, who wrote, "Byrne is an engaging writer whose previous books have animated the endearing Austen, the formerly enslaved Black English noblewoman Dee Dee Elizabeth Bell, and the Circle of Evelyn Waugh. Despite its bulk, The Adventures of Miss Barbara Pym skips easily along in bite-sized chapters, aims to rollick, and rollick it does." The Adventures of Miss Barbara Pym was a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week and a Book of the Year in 4 national newspapers. Paula Byrne is author of 7 highly acclaimed works of nonfiction, including The Genius of Jane Austen, The Real Jane Austen, A Life in Small Things, and Kick, the true story of Kit Kennedy, JFK's forgotten sister and heir to Chatsworth, as well as 2 novels, Look to Your Wife and Mirror, Mirror. She has edited a Routledge literary sourcebook on Jane Austen's Emma, co-edited the poetry anthology for Wellbeing, Stressed Unstressed, Classic Poems to Ease the Mind, and is a regular reviewer for the Saturday Times. And I just want to interrupt here and say, if you're wondering why there's so much Jane Austen in this introduction, Barbara Pym is a huge fan of Jane Austen. You know, if you'd only read the novels, you might not know. So, and I just want to say this is a super special event on 700 130 different levels, but one of them is our conversation partner, Bill Goldstein, who is not only has a wonderful bio that I'm going to read in a second, he's also one of my oldest friends, and he introduced me to Barbara Pym, and for which, if he had done nothing else, I would be forever grateful. He's the founding editor of the book site New York Times on the web, reviews books and interviews authors for NBC's Weekend Today in New York, is the curator of public programs at Roosevelt House, the Public Policy Institute of New York's Hunter College. He has a PhD in English from City University of New York Graduate Center and is the author of The World Broke in Two, Virginia Woolf, C.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, E.M. Forster, and the Year That Changed Literature, for which he visited Boswell. He is currently working on a biography of Larry Kramer. And before I turn off my camera, I do want to show everybody the Barbara Pym figurine that the wonderful Suzanne Zulli gave to me. And also, I just want to note, I don't speak French, but I guess this is what you give to Daniel, because I just got a copy of one of Barbara Pym's novels in French from a friend.
Which
and
one?
It's the one, I don't know which book it is.
Well,
so
while we're talking, use Google Translate.
it's Dulcie Mainwaring. So whoever that is.
No Fond Return of Love.
No Fond Return of Love.
Return of Love.
Yeah. With that said, I give you Paula Byrne and Bill Goldstein. Welcome to the Boswell Virtual.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Kim. And thank you, Paula, for being here. I couldn't be more excited. I've been looking forward to doing this. I mean, ever since Daniel months and months and months ago mentioned it to me as a possibility. And of course, I immediately said yes. And as Daniel hinted, there are people, and I am one of them, who ordered the book last year immediately upon publication from Blackwell's. And so I read it last year and loved it and felt that desolate until I found out that it was actually being published here too. So I'm very glad that the year has passed quickly and here you are, published in the United States. So to begin, I guess my first question is a very basic one. Why Barbara Pym? And can you talk a little bit about her as a writer, of course, but also her reputation? She always seems to me a writer being rediscovered, and yet she doesn't always stay rediscovered. It's sort of like trickle-down economics or something. You know, there's a long arc of her fame that doesn't somehow connect to the large literary world in the way that she deserves. And this seems to be her fate in life as well as in her afterlife.
Such a good question. So I'm going to be honest, I did come to Barbara Pym late in life. And I lived in Oxford for 8 years. And I realized very quickly that there was a huge Barbara Pym secret society, or not so secret society, because everyone was very vociferous about their love of Barbara Pym. And I'd never read Barbara Pym. And we had a bookshop, one of the only independent bookshops, call out here to Daniel, in Oxford. And I went along one day because I love this bookshop. They used to play jazz and have jazz concerts. It's brilliant. And Dennis was completely mad on Barbara Pym, and he won't mind me saying this, but he was crazy. And I went to see Dennis one day and I said, look, you know, I really need something to read that's going to make me laugh. And Dennis just pulled down this volume and said, have you ever read Barbara Pym? I said, no, never heard of her. And he said, well, just read a bit of this. And I read 3 lines and I was absolutely laughing my head off in the middle of this bookshop in Oxford. And then I just bought sort of 4 copies of the different novels and took them home. And then I realized, as I said, there was this whole sort of secret of these brilliant Oxford, has to be said, men, I'm going to say it. A lot of men who, what is that about Barbara Pym? The men love her. Anyway, and then I would say things like, oh, I'm really loving Barbara Pym. And then people, oh, she's extraordinary. And I get all this, you know, all these Pymites coming out to the woodwork. And then I thought to myself, you know, it's just such a shame that she's not more widely known. What are the biographies? And then I read a couple of the biographies and they were not very good. And then I realized that the Pym archive was in the Bodleian. I lived in Oxford College. My husband was the head of an Oxford College. I was in the Bodleian every day. And I just thought, well, maybe this would be quite an interesting woman to write about, given that also she loved Jane Austen, Kim. And so it just felt like an embarrassment of riches, if I'm honest. It was just felt like there was this archive waiting to happen. And what I didn't realize at the time was that I had all sorts of connections with Barbara Pym that were totally unknown to me at the time I embarked, or even thought about, maybe this should be my next subject.
That's sort of, I mean, what is so interesting about what you're saying is that if we look at the books you've published and the authors you've written about, it's almost like a natural progression, and yet appearances deceive, I mean, which I think is also part of the plot or theme of your biography, is that appearances with Barbara Pym often deceive, and the way she lived her life on the surface was often at odds with her emotional feelings. I mean, what she was really going through, and then also how she's been read. I mean, I think that we tend to think of her as she was a quote spinster, I mean, who lived with her sister, and we then begin to think of it as a much more narrow world than it really is. So when you started working on the book, did you see thematic connections, not in the life, but in the works of Jane Austen, about whom you've written, and then also Evelyn Waugh in your book, Mad World? I mean, I think she aspired to a certain kind of novel that he sometimes wrote. I mean, there are elements of his comedy, and then, also elements of his great melancholy and kind of despair of the state of the world and how to live in it.
Well, completely. The most important thing for me is I like writing about funny people. I really like jokes. And I think it's really hard to write good jokes. I think that's a really challenging thing to do. And people sort of think about comic novels as inferior, because Anna Karenina is wonderful. I've read it about 25 million times, but I think writing comedy is very difficult. And I think making people laugh aloud is really difficult. And the three people in my life, four that have made me laugh out loud, are Jane Austen, Barbara Pym, Evelyn Waugh, and P.G. Wodehouse. And there is no one that actually makes me cry with laughter. And that's a really hard thing to do. It takes incredible expertise and comic timing to get that right. And so when I think when I read Barbara Pym, I didn't know the Jane Austen connection at all. I just thought she's really, really funny. And I like the small world, I like the sense of, the clergy, the English country village. That's very much my bag. I love that. I love it. I think because in terms of comic types, it's just brilliant. And I had no idea when I embarked on the biography that those connections and resonances would be there. No idea at all. I didn't even know she liked Jane Austen. I didn't know at all. But I just thought there was something Jane Austen about the way that she wrote about English country life, which was also universal, that anyone, and Americans I know love Jane Austen, but they love Barbara Pym too. And I think that was what, I didn't know that at the time, but I just simply thought, this is a writer that should have more readers. And I didn't have any other more exalted feeling other than, why is she not read more? She is brilliantly funny and brilliantly clever. And going back to Jane Austen, Jane Austen was very young when she wrote the first version of Pride and Prejudice, First Impressions. And Barbara Pym was 21 and still at Oxford when she wrote the first version of her, I think, in a way, a perfect comic novel, Sometime Gazelle. And you just think, well, what kind of genius is that? Like, what were you and I doing at 21? I wasn't writing a brilliant comic genius. I was in the pub all night, but, and I just think, and of course, she revised that novel as great writers do. But even so, to have the temerity, the confidence to even embark on a comic novel that is, to my mind, so perfect. Sometimes Gazelle is so perfect in the way that Pride and Prejudice is perfect. You think nothing could be improved upon it, nothing could be added, and nothing could be detracted. This is a perfect novel. And these were women who, it was never easy to write as a woman, never easy to be supported. So for me, all those connections came later, even with Evil and War, and finding those connections was wonderful. But I never started with that, Bill. I just started with thinking, why don't more people read this woman? Because she's extraordinary. And a bit like Jane Austen, she grows with each novel.
So I want to ask, I mean, first I want to talk about something before we get to her being 21, because the temerity, the word you use about her writing her first novel, is related very much to an adventuresome young woman who took a lot of risks and did a lot of things that young women of her time didn't do. I mean, the title is The Adventures of Miss Barbara Pym, and she was adventuresome and very young. But before we get to her and her achievement then, if you could say something about when you had the idea to do it and then to look at her papers, was there something in the papers that you began to look at that you saw and said, oh yes, I can write this biography? There's something really more and new to say. Was there some document or?
Oh yeah, no, 100%, because I've got to be honest, because I loved her so much when I started very late in my 40s reading her, just thought, why don't people know more about her? And I wrote to the Barbara Pym Society and said, this is just wonderful, and I would love her to be my next subject. And they've been amazing and supportive and wonderful. But a few people said, why do we need another biography of Barbara Pym? And I just thought, oh, darlings, you really do, because most of it is wrong. That's, you know, none of it is properly right. And that sounds arrogant, but it's just true. And then thinking, being on the doorstep of the Bodleian and thinking to have the chance to really excavate and mine that archive, but also I wanted to bring it to life. And do you know, this is the funniest thing, Bill, because when I first embarked on it, I thought, this is going to be the most boring life ever. And I thought to myself, doesn't matter. She's boring. Her life's boring. The novels are brilliant. We don't worry about that. I'm going to write a really short book and I'll bring more people to Barbara Pym. And then I got into the archive and then I was like, what was I thinking? This is ridiculous. No one's life's boring. No one's life's ordinary. Shame on me for thinking that, because once I got in that archive and then realized what she had lived through, what she had been through, all the things that had happened to her, and this, as I say, embarrassment was rich, and then thinking, how dare I be so arrogant as to say it's not an exciting life? Shame on me. And then I just thought, this is not a boring life. This is an absolutely fascinating life, what this woman lived through, and the terrible heartbreak she suffered, and all of those things we can talk about later. But I just thought instantly, I've got this wrong. I've got it wrong. And then I had to write to my editor and say, oops, got it wrong. Thought this would be a really short book. And suddenly I've got in the archive and I'm like, oh my goodness, there are many, many things that need to be unpicked and unraveled. And this book's going to be probably twice as long, sorry it's so long guys, or 3 times as long as I contracted, but the story needs to be told. And it was a wake-up call. I've written 9 books and I thought, never say someone's life's boring, never say that.
Well, it isn't boring at all. And it was, I mean, what's so interesting to me is, as you were saying about how young she was when she wrote the first version of Some Tame Gazelle, the earliest version of it. And then what she was, tell us who Barbara Pym was sort of before she was 21, and then the kind of liberation that she really experienced as a young woman who went to Oxford, and then what her striking out as an independent person, which cost her a lot emotionally. I mean, life did not always work out for her in the way that she either romantically expected or professionally, but she took so many risks that really differentiate her from what a lot of other women were able to do. Not that other women weren't eager to do what she did, but it was mean, we're talking about the 1930s, and it was a very different time. I mean, almost, just a few years after Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. I mean, so if you tell us a little bit about who she was growing up, and then what happened to her when she went to Oxford and became a different woman, or on the path.
It was a sort of, again, I would say sort of, in English terms, lower middle class, but maybe middle class life. Father was a solicitor, very churchy life, living in Shropshire. It later transpired, she never knew this, but that her father was the illegitimate son of an aristocrat. And she never knew this. Her sister didn't know this, but so there was that sort of stigma of, she wouldn't have known that, but it's interesting that there was a real sort of aristocratic strain. That might have nothing to do with the price of fish as far as I'm concerned, but I think it's interesting. It's a story Barbara Pym would have loved, let's face it. And then lived a middle-class life, churchy life. But her mother, Irina, who was ambitious, and I mean, I've written many biographies in which mothers, I'm writing a book about Thomas Hardy at the minute, and mothers are often so important. And it was Irina who thought these girls were smart girls, clever girls. And she was reading all these wonderful anthological boarding school books, in the late 1900s, early 30s, where, girls went to boarding school and they played hockey and lacrosse and stuff. And she sent Barbara and then Hilary to Highton School in Liverpool. I'm from Liverpool. And I knew Highton College, although it was no longer Highton College. So I kept, these weird connections kept coming. It's so strange. And it was a big risk for someone like Irene to send Barbara to boarding school, because in those days, if you were middle class, you were upper class, you did, or you didn't really with middle class people. But anyway, she did. And Barbara was always writing plays as a young girl, head of the English Society at Highton School in Liverpool, and then got into Oxford. And I think for that time, when I say got into Oxford, was a very big thing, actually, because middle-class girls, well, women were banned for many years, but and that's another story. But for Barbara to go up in the early very early 30s as a middle-class girl from the north, some people say it's the Midlands, whatever, but it was not. Oswestry isn't. It's very close to where I went on holidays all the time. So and I'm from Liverpool, and she always shopped in Liverpool. So I felt she was a bit of a northern girl. To go to Oxford in as a woman where there was still very few women, and she met all these posh boys and it was great because there was few women. She had a great time. There were so few women, all the men went for her in a big way. But it was a big thing. And I was always very struck with this. And I thought, people just thought she was a bit of an idiot. Like, she just chased boys the whole time and ran round, the Broad and the Tile, and just sort of chased people around Oxford. And I was sort of rather wonderful that, everyone thought she was a bit silly and a bit of a limpet and sort of chasing boys. And here she was actually writing this perfect comic novel. And I sort of love that. And miles away from Virginia Woolf. And I do think her takedown from Virginia Woolf, sorry, Bill, is very funny. When, and she just thought Virginia Woolf was a bit silly. But then when she read the diary, she was like, oh my God, she's amazing. But, she was so different from, she wasn't posh in that way. But I think there she was thinking about how she could be funny. How can I be funny about this? And how can I have my Oxford set funny and set them 40 years ahead? Who else was doing that? No one. And then all of a sudden, these boys who thought she was a bit silly suddenly saying, oh wow, you are talented. And I think that was hard for a woman in those times. And that background of, I say, lower middle class, middle class, however you want to call it, but certainly not literary at all, not literary. And then being with all these posh boys at Christchurch who quoted sort of Shakespeare and Shelley and sort of thinking, I feel a bit silly, and then writing this perfect novel, and suddenly all these boys thinking, actually, you're really quite cool. I think that trajectory for me was so shocking and wonderful. I thought, how many other Barbara Pyms were there that sort of, didn't quite make it? And thank God she did. But I think it was very hard for women. And I think women from her background coming to Oxford, it must have felt like a completely different world, and it was a different world.
And that's why I said how close in time it really is to a room of one's own. I mean, you get a sense of what people thought of women then and what opportunities were open to women. I'm curious if you can say, I mean, so she writes Some Tame Gazelle, an early version, but it's not published until 1950. And I mean, we obviously can't go into every detail about her very busy life in that time, but if you could talk sort of about what she was doing instead. I mean, she's in the war. I mean, she takes part in the, I mean, does national service during the war, but also she begins at Oxford and then afterward to have a very unhappy romantic life. I mean, there's a kind of exuberance at first, and then she doesn't seem quite satisfied by any of the, or the men never seem quite satisfied by her. There's a sense of what she is willing to settle for in romance that somehow seems so at odds with her adventuresomeness in terms of her writing and even in the way she leads her life. Can you explain anything about the dichotomy there? Why she?
Well, I think when she went to Oxford, when there were so few women, the men fell over themselves, sort of really, and she wasn't. And I said that with great reservation, a classical beauty. And I don't care about that because she was so funny and lively and sparky. But she was in this environment where so few women, a lot of men, and she did get a lot of attention. And she did have a taste, God bless her, for very incredibly handsome men. Who wouldn't? But she did. And sort of posh, clever men, sort of brideshead types. And you know, she fell in love with these unsuitable men. They treated her very, very badly. And I mean, Julian Amory, all sorts of men that she fell in love with very, very quickly because she was deeply romantic.
Yes.
And that you're right to say that, like, she was deeply, deeply romantic, and she did, obviously she wanted to be happy and to be loved, but she just fell in love with the wrong men all the time, or gay men, or beautiful men who were probably not in her league, which is a horrible thing to say, but it just is true, whether you like it or not. It's a fact. So she always felt disappointed with the gorgeous men that she snogged and had sex with, and she was very liberated for her time because she did have sexual relationships. And I still maintain, way before Sylvia Plath bit Ted Hughes on the cheek, Barbara Pym bit gorgeous Henry Harvey on the cheek in the Trout pub. And for years people said the bitten cheek were mosquitoes. And I lived in Oxford for 8 years, and I was like, there are no mosquitoes on the 1st of May in Oxford in the Trout. She bit him. And then I found this wonderful diary where she said, I bit someone else, but not as hard as I bit Henry on the cheek. I was like, woo, I knew she bit him on the cheek. So I was sort of, and I think she was so ahead of her time in the way that she felt that women could be sexual beings. And Henry would say things like, oh, you're just cheap, and, you know, you're used by people. And that desperately hurt her. But there was a part of her that didn't really care about that. And she just sort of thought, well, why should I care about that? So again, very sort of ahead of her time. And all of that was poured into these extraordinary novels, all this sense of what it felt like for female experience in a male world. Because that's what it was like in Oxford. It was a male world. And she felt, you know, yes, she got benefits from that. But at the same time, it was a really hard world when you're not actually technically beautiful. And she would often say, I'm not as beautiful as all these gorgeous Alisons, you know, upper class Alisons. I'm different to that. But it's what she did with that experience and how she used that experience, and she put it into these novels. And then to think she's the only one all these people remember, like Evelyn Waugh. Evelyn Waugh was caught up with all these glamorous Etonians who no one's ever heard of now, but everyone remembers because you need to be an outsider. You have to be an outsider to look at that experience and to write about it. And if you're in too deep, and if you're in, you can't do it, and it's hopeless. You've got to take a step out and say, I like this. and I don't like it. And I think that was Pym and war, actually.
Well, that's really
Does that make sense? Does that make sense to you?
It makes total sense. It makes total sense. I mean, if you could say, so the war is for her, as it was for many people, an opening up of the world. I mean, we're talking about World War II. And if you could talk about what her national service was, and then what her life was when she came back from the war. I mean, because she has a great number, I mean, she used the word again, adventures, that are always being tucked away for future use, whether it's observations, being an outsider. I mean, things that she notices, things that she comes to love, types of people that she is able then, when she becomes a writer after the war, I mean, publishing some type of
yeah, no, I love your phrase tucked away. I think she would love tucked away, because there's lots of things that are tucked away in Barbara Pym. And I think a lot of that was guilt, because not going into too much detail, but during the 30s, she did flirt with Nazi Germany and fell in love with a Nazi who was very close to Hitler. And although she always felt he was on the right side of Nazism, that's very controversial, but that's what she felt. She felt terribly guilty. And I think part of her service was atonement. I think she wanted to atone. But what I think is one of the wonderful things before the atonement, when she went back to Shropshire, close to where I lived, was, and then wrote this home front novel that was never published and would have been brilliant, and I'm so sad she didn't. But what I think one of the brilliant things she wrote about the war was the way that war galvanized women who had nothing else to do. And then all of a sudden you see old women, spinsters, old women, who suddenly come good because they're needed, and the wars galvanize them, and they want to look after the kids who come from Birkenhead. And I love that. I thought, because she's always observing this, she might hate these women and find them annoying and boring because she's been to Oxford and you can never come home, can you? But she comes home, and then she's sort of saying, oh my gosh, women are really galvanized by the war effort. And I think there are very few people who write from a bird's eye view, because I read the diaries very, very closely and the home front novel, and the day-to-day account of how it felt for women, what it felt like when the men were fighting, and you're on your own front line, actually, because you're growing your vegetables to feed the troops, and you're taking in evacuees, and you're going to the air raid shelters, and you're learning to know how to make bandages. And at any time you've got sick men and bloody men coming to you, and you've got to, and I love the way that she can really see that war's not all bad, it's bloody awful, but it's not all bad for these women who go, I've now got purpose. So Agnes Grote in that home front novel, there's a wonderful scene that actually makes me cry, when the evacuee children come, and her sister, sort of Connie, says, ooh, they're all got full of lice and they're all filthy. And Agnes says, how dare you, this is the war effort. And she says, go and wash them and get the lice up their hair, and this is the war. And you sort of think this old bat, this old curmudgeon, suddenly becomes a hero. She becomes a heroine. She suddenly says, this is, and I think that's what Barbara Pym did, in the same way I think Jane Austen would have done, actually, that she would have just said, what is it like for the women? And then she was there at the home front working very, very hard, and then had her heart broken, and then went to join the Wrens. And honestly, for the first time in her life, she met working class people. She'd never met working class people ever. And that really struck me. I was like, she went to Naples, and she actually fell in love with this man called Ian Starkey. And she'd never even met a working class man, never mind falling in love with one. And so the war really liberated her in all sorts of ways, and opened her up. And she did bits of writing, but not properly. And then after the war, when she came back, it was like bedsit land. It was London. It was women who, many men had died in the war. You're not going to necessarily find a husband. And then all of her novels reflect that. To me, they reflect all of those changes. They reflect what it was like to be post-war, living in dreary London, in bedsit land. And people said, oh, Barbara Pym, she only writes one novel, it's the same novel. It's just not true. It's just not true. Every novel changes as her experience changes. So I think she had a good war in the sense that, you know, nothing too horrible happened to her, but I think it influenced her writing. And like many, many people, you were never the same after the Second World War. Never, like the Evelyn War. How could you be the same person? You could not be. So it did change her. And in a way, it softened her and it hardened her, if that makes sense. She became more hardened and she became more softened. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it makes sense to me.
It does. I mean, one of the things as you're speaking and as I was reading the book, I mean, one of the things that comes across, I mean, is of course the great comedy of Sometimes They'll, Excellent Women. I mean, all of her books. I mean, Glass of Blessings, I mean, is sort of a switch to a slightly more melancholy register, it seems to me. But what you're talking about is women in the post-war era trying to find their place in a world of somewhat of deprivation, but also in which they are uneasy about returning to the smaller worlds in which they are expected to live. And so you find them thinking about other people because they are trying to live this larger life and society isn't necessarily letting them. And so they're finding outlets where they can. And it seems to me that they're struggling and wanting to achieve something, to make emotional connections. And after reading your book, I reread Excellent Women and Sometimes Gazelle, and this melancholy that I hadn't really felt when I read them many times before, thinking of her life informed that. I mean, these are not sad novels. I mean, they're comic novels. And yet something about her personal experience seemed, to use that phrase again, tucked away in them in a way that hides autobiography rather than, even though Sometimes Gazelle is about two sisters who are living in spinsterhood. I mean, as she and her sister, I mean, her sister wasn't a spinster, but, you know, later lived together. And all of that seems like prophecy. And yet I found something so moving about her artistic struggle and the perfection of her pages eked out from trying to live the life that she expected in the 30s and yet being in the 50s somehow.
Well, I think that's so beautiful. What you just said is so beautiful. I think you should have written this book, not me, because I just think I wish I thought about that when I wrote it. Because what you say is so moving and beautiful, and I 100% agree with that. And I think with Pym, you know, she's very good at tone and mood, and I think tone and mood are very, very difficult to write about, and she writes really well about those things. And Philip Larkin, who was, you know, became a great friend, he uses wonderful word, this plangent quality. And plangent is a word I'd never heard before, and I looked it up, and it means mournful. And it was Larkin who first said, you know, you're really, really, really funny, but you're really sad and plangent. And I just thought, gosh, you were the first person, Larkin, to really nail that. And you've, I think, seen that, you know, for yourself, that there is something very melancholic and sad. And she's always trying to make you feel happy. And the more someone tries to make you feel happy, but they're sad, the more sad you feel. You know, that's how it goes with those writers, that, you know, you know there's something inescapably sad and plangent, and it's such a wonderful word that Larkin uses about her novels. And then as time went on, and I think life became really difficult for her, you get less of that perfect comic tone and mood, and much more of the plangent tone where things just become very sad. And, you know, I find it extraordinary that when Cape dropped her and said, "You're not with the times," and I thought, hang on a minute, you are writing about gay men, you're writing about women falling in love with gay men. What do you think? What are you actually thinking that you don't think this is relevant? You know, and I think as she grew older and probably a little bit more depressed and probably more melancholic, it fed into her novels. So by the time you get to A Glass of Blessings, which I think is brilliant, and The Sweet Dove Died, you're on a whole different plane. I mean, you've suddenly become in a very different place. And to me, you know, that is an extraordinary achievement.
I realize that, well, first of all, anything I have said, I mean, comes from reading your biography and then rereading the books with everything I learned in your biography in mind. But when you're talking now about sort of the plangent tone, the mournful tone, I realized that one of the other favorite writers of mine is a writer who just had a new novel also published yesterday called Andrew Holleran, who is a gay writer whose first novel was published in 1978 called Dancer from the Dance, and his new novel is called The Kingdom of Sand. And in many of the books, there's, if it's either a first-person narrator or a very lonely protagonist who doesn't quite live in the world, like we see him living in a quotidian daily world, and yet there's some essential loneliness to the person. And so when you were speaking, what I had thought of when I was reading The Kingdom of Sand is that it's a first-person narrator of this writer, this older man now, his loneliness. And I realized that we're not sure who he's speaking to. There's so much he can't say to his friends, to his parents, that he's telling it to the reader in a kind of communion with the reader. So the writing itself, the art, is the triumph over loneliness, I think, for something that is also in the author, not just in the character. And so when I think of everything you show Barbara Pym doing and how assiduously she continued to work and try, that she is trying to triumph over both rejection. I mean, she's had a lifetime of romantic rejection. Then she has the rejection, which I want to talk about in a bit. And then the triumph, as I say, over the loneliness. She is continuing to write books, even though she is not being published, and it takes time. It takes over a decade. But if we could talk, you mentioned her being dropped by Kate in 1963. So she's published 6 novels, and this is a cataclysm, an apocalyptic moment in her quiet life. If you could say what happened to her, because it's such a central part of her biography, and then the story of her afterlife and being rediscovered.
So briefly, she worked at the African Institute and was sort of the PA and editor for her boss, who she wrote about in some of her novels. And that was her day job. And that was sort of office London life. But she had this other life that was her real life, which was writing. And that sustained her. And she didn't really show off about it or talk about it, but it sustained her. And then she wrote this one, you know, the novels were always well received, well reviewed. And she had a niche audience. And there was this library in England called the Boots Lending Library, and they would always buy her books because she just did well in libraries. Women liked her books, you know. And then lots of things changed when municipal libraries came along and Boots folded, and the 60s came, and the publishers just thought, she's not sexy, she's not 60s, you know, she's not hip. And she was dropped. And it really, and I loved what you said about just this lifetime of romantic rejection. And that was pretty darn awful. But then she still had her book. So then to get rejected from that was huge for her. And I think one of the most extraordinary things is she kept on writing, a bit like Jane Austen, when Jane Austen was rejected in 1803, when her first novel was accepted, but when she was living in Bath. And this was First Impressions, the first version of Pride and Prejudice. Kim, am I right about that? I hope I'm right about that. I think I'm right about that. Yeah, and Cadell rejected her. And what does a strong woman do? Say, I'm rejected, I'm rubbish, forget it. Or do they say, you know what, I'm just going to carry on because I think I know I'm really good. I think I know I'm really good. I may not be, but I think I am. And so Pym and Jane Austen just kept writing. And it just moves me beyond, it makes me cry that she had all these books in the linen cupboard, you know, in her London house, but just kept writing because she wanted to write. It made her feel alive. And also because at some level, I think she thought, like Jane Austen, I might be read after I'm dead. Maybe, just maybe I'm good enough for that. So, and it takes an awful lot when you keep getting rejected to say, I still think I've got something good to say. And you know, she wrote to Philip Ross, said, you know, oh why don't people want to read novels like the ones I write anymore? You know, why? And you know, at some level thinking maybe one day things come around in cycles and maybe we will. But I think it takes enormous courage in the face of rejection, romantic rejection and literary rejection, career rejection, just to say, I think I know I'm quite good and I'm just going to keep going. And I just admired her so much. And that's why when she did have her renaissance, her resurgence, it must have just felt the best thing in the world, because, you know, if any writer deserved it other than Jane Austen, you know, Barbara Pym deserved that. And then when she was suddenly rediscovered, it must have just felt so wonderful, because she had all this backlog of these wonderful books in the linen cupboard that nobody wanted to read. And then all of a sudden, Philip Larkin and David Cecil rediscovered her and said, she's so underrated, she's so brilliant. And then all of a sudden she was hot news and everybody wanted a piece of Barbara Pym. And I'm just so glad that she had that opportunity for that, because it would have been devastating to me if we only started realizing how wonderful she was after she died. So it was a very hard time for her. And it was 15 years in the wilderness, as she called it the wilderness. So she had 15 years of not being published. And heartbreakingly, she would send out novels, you know, day after day after day after day, and get rejected. I don't know what that does to your spirit.
I mean, and also, I used to be a book editor, I mean, in the 90s, before the internet, you know, when manuscripts are returned time and again, you know, those who receive it afterwards can tell that they've been read before. So it's not as if you're sending someone a digital copy or a freshly printed out copy.
Yeah.
So the energy that it takes to do all that is even more severe, you know, literally on the paper that you are sending from one publisher to another. One detail just struck me. I mean, so many, but so this happens early in 1963. And so there's the humiliation of the rejection. And then her typewriter is also stolen at basically the same time. And I thought, what more can the fates do to her? I mean, obviously it was not someone who knew necessarily that she was a writer, but I think you say that their house in London was broken into the first time, and then the second time was when they came back and stole her typewriter. I mean, so it's just like, oh, please, oh dear God, you know, give something to Barbara Pym. And what you're talking about is this rediscovery in 1977 when the Times Literary Supplement.
And you're right about the double burglary, because you know, she makes a joke about, she was writing to one of her friends and the letter was in the typewriter when it was stolen. So she has to sort of write another letter. And on top of all that, you know, she's in love with a very beautiful gay man who does lead her on, actually, who and actually does sort of fall in love with her, really, but can't reciprocate, obviously. So and then rejects her. And I think the Skipper, you know, relationship is very, very crucial. And that's why I think she writes the two great gay novels, really. You know, I think those two novels, Glass of Blessings and The Sweet Delight, are just extraordinary, about, you know, straight women falling in love with gay men. Who else? That's why I get so angry with these publishers. What are you thinking when you say nobody wants to read about Barbara Pym? You're so cozy, and you write about clergy and vicars. I'm like, no, she's writing about women falling in love with gay men, and that's way ahead of her time. And I think the beauty of those novels, and at that time when she was burgled and she was having a terrible time, Skipper was messing her around, and she knew he was gay, and she knew that it was not going anywhere, but she still loved him. And that's what love is. You know, it's hopeless and terrible, and you know, it's not, you know, that's what it is to be human. And I think all of that was really hard for her, and yet she still kept that sense of humor. I'm not sentimentalizing this at all, but she could still make a joke. But there were times with the Skipper relationship where I think the bitterness really came out, and rightly so, frankly, but with the bitterness where she just thought screw you, you're really messing me around and you're really making me miserable and you're leading me on. And then that cruelty of when he brings the boyfriend to supper. And it's just unbelievably cruel. And I think she's so good at writing about the cruelty of human relationships.
Right.
And yet somehow it's not bitter, it's not, she felt bitter, but she could write about those terrible experiences of being rejected by Cape, being rejected by the man she loved who was gay, being rejected by all sorts of not having children, all of that, and still sort of keeping that, slight lightness of touch. I mean, there was bitterness creeping in with the novels, but she could laugh at herself. And I personally think it's a northern quality. I'm a northern girl. And, so I feel like no matter how bad life is, if you can sort of laugh at it, it can't be that bad. And I had a massive kinship with Barbara Pym when I was writing this book. And, I wrote it very quickly. And, you mentioned the title, and because I was thinking, how do I make this interesting? And I read that she said, I feel like I'm an 18th century heroine. And I'd been reading Tom Jones.
Oh.
And I just thought, oh, she's sort of a picaresque heroine. And I thought, wouldn't it be funny if I did the Tom Jones thing and just did the titles to show that you might think she's a really boring woman, but she's not actually. She's not boring. She's actually had a lot of experiences and she's lived through a lot and she's suffered a lot. And yet she's still sort of retained that wonderful humor and could poke fun at herself. And also she never felt sorry for herself. I really think that's the worst sin in life. If you feel sorry for yourself, then sod off. Like, no, you just don't do that. Like, we all have horrible times, but you don't feel sorry. And she never felt sorry for herself.
Well, I mean, we have time for some questions from the audience. First of all, thank you. I mean, there's so much more I want to talk to you about. I just want to show one treasure that, because as Daniel said, I mean, when Daniel and I were working in publishing decades ago, before Daniel lived in Milwaukee, we both lived in New York. I still live in New York. I was a big Barbara Pym fan, and I worked at Publishers Weekly, and I had begun to read her, and Hazel Holt came to the United States for doing some publicity. I forget about which book. And I did an interview with her for Publishers Weekly. And one thing I remember is that we went to the Grand Central Oyster Bar, which is a fish restaurant, which was near my office. And on the menu, it's just this huge menu, and what's available, because they have a price next to it. So not everything that day has a price to it. And on the menu was sturgeon. And so Hazel Holt said she had to order the sturgeon because in England, all the sturgeon, like all the swans, are owned by the Queen.
The Queen.
Eat it there. So, I mean, that detail just has stayed in my mind for all these years. I put it into the interview. But at a later time, or around then, I guess, whenever A Very Private Eye was published, there was, this is Hazel Holt's.
It's lovely.
Barbara Pym's literary executor, and her sister Hilary Walton edited a selection of her diaries and letters.
Of course, yeah.
And this is signed by both of them. I mean, we're not going to be able to see it. In 1984.
That's lovely.
September 17th, 1984. And then I went to England and saw Hazel Holt there, and she took me to Barnes Cottage. And Hilary, one year, I knew I had this signed book, but what I did not remember is that I had a Christmas card from Hilary that she sent me. I don't know if people can see this. In 1984, I believe, or 1985. Bill, wishing you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year from Hilary Walton. So I discovered the Christmas card. So I thank you, and I thank Daniel for inviting me to do this, because I got down my Barbara Pym from the shelf. And the other thing is, you were talking about the success of her books at the lending libraries like Boots and W.H. Smith. And so my copy of Some Tame Gazelle, first edition, that isn't in particularly good condition or anything, but I love, and that it's from the it's deaccessioned, I guess, by the W.H. Smith Library. And so it seemed so perfect, given what I read in your book about how her success at the circulating libraries and how that changed when municipal libraries and the way people bought books changed by 1963, that her first novel, my copy of it, came from the very thing that had made her career as sustainable for as long as it was. The women who borrowed books from Boots and subscribed to Boots and W.H. Smith, and in the 19th century, it was Moody's.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. But can I ask you a question? Did my biography surprise you in any way?
Oh, completely. I mean, first of all, one of the things that I loved is that you show the effect. I mean, there's the question from the audience I'm going to ask before we close, but it's related to this. The thing about A Very Private Eye, the diaries and letters, as enjoyable as it is, and as much information as is in there, it's very protective in a not surprising way. I mean, one of the editors is her literary executor and friend, and the other is her sister. And then Hazel wrote one of the early biographies, A Lot to Ask. And so the protectiveness, I don't think I read it understanding that protectiveness. And what your book all these years later shows is that, in particular, I mean, not only all the details of her romantic life and what she really went through, but the rejection of her books by Cape and then other publishers, that in the earlier biographies, it's almost as if it sort of just happens and then she moves on in a way.
Yeah.
So the depth of her, I don't want to say depression, because she does move on and begins to write again, but the cataclysm that it was in her life, I feel that the earlier books leave us to imagine it. What you do is show both how she felt about it and then how it changed her life and how it refocused her eventually on work. And so your book solved many, many mysteries for me, of someone who has read Barbara Pym for decades and yet didn't know or thought I knew the limit of what could be understood about her and how wrong I was. So your book was a revelation in that sense of all of the romantic hopes and ideas that she had, and all of the romantic knocks that she felt. And I felt that in A Very Private Eye and in A Lot to Ask, that it sort of took, I use this word advisedly because it sounds more sinister. I think those books took the line that reading her novels would make you think that she's just like Mildred Lathbury, or she and Hilary became the two sisters who were in Some Tame Gazelle. And so you revealed so much, not only about her daily life, but about her emotional life and how hard her life was, which was hidden to me. So it was a revelation. And I mean,
well, thank you so much. And can I just say, if anybody listening here wants to ask more questions, they can always contact me on Twitter and I'll answer any. If we don't obviously have time today, but if people have a burning question, please, reach out to me on Twitter. And I mainly do Twitter. And if you really feel you've got a question that I haven't answered or I didn't give enough attention to, I'm really, really happy to sort of answer any questions.
Well, so the question that we have here is, I'm sure you will elaborate on this during your talk, and we've talked a little bit about it now, but if not, I would love to get a taste. This is from Arnie Perlstein. I would love to get a taste of the details of what the existing biographies got wrong, or what inadequacies made it clear to you that there was another book to be written.
Well, do you know, Bill, I think you've answered the question, because you've answered on his question, because you basically said it was written by her sister and her best friend, and that it's just no way that anyone writing about their sister and their best friend are going to do anything other than protect the person they're writing about, as they should, and also the people who are still alive, as they should. And I felt protective towards Barbara. I fell in love with her, but as a biographer, you are compelled to tell the facts. And the fact is, a lot of facts were, for very good reasons, hidden or glossed over or expurgated, or all of those things for good reasons. But that time has gone by now, and it's not my job to I can protect her as a woman, as someone I admire, but it's incumbent on me as a biographer, where people trust you, to tell the truth. You should tell the truth. That's the end of it. And you can tell the truth in a loving way, in a kind way, but you have to tell the truth. And the fact remains that so many facts were just wrong.
Right.
Well, it's so wrong. And like, you would literally, on one date, it would say this happened on that date, and I'd go in the archive and say it wasn't even that date. And not to denigrate what went before, but it's just true. And then, we don't really like that, so we'll just leave that out. So Barbara being involved in this very bad road crash when she was a very young girl was completely brushed over, and it affected Barbara. She felt it was two young men were killed because of her mother's driving, and it was very, unless you see how that affects a sensitive person. But time and time again, stuff was just left out, or left because they just thought, well, we don't want to talk about that. And as I say, with absolutely right reasons, if people are still alive, you don't want to hurt them. But to the point where I was just thinking, well, this is just getting silly now, because how can you fully understand this writer without knowing what she went through? So I was just very conscious that I had to sort of navigate a difficult sea in terms of, get the facts right, love, because that's what I should be doing, and then be sensitive. But I did get annoyed when I kept thinking so much stuff is actually wrong.
Well, one of the things that a person has posted in the chat in response to what you're saying is it's very similar to what Henry and Cassandra Austen, and later her nephew, and did with the first biography, the memoir of
Absolutely,
James.
Good example.
So
good example, and I say for good reasons. So when Henry Austen says in that utterly absurd, ridiculous biographical notice, my sister never said anything selfish or silly or unkind, and you just go, well, if and then you get all the letters, and all of those things are wrong. And I think, of course, Henry's protecting his sister, but the fact is, it's just not true. And so I always find it really funny, Henry's biographical notice, because literally pretty much everything Henry says is wrong, and also he never tells us what she looks like, which is very annoying. And you just think, yes, you're protecting your sister's legacy, and that's absolutely fine, as it should be, but it is the work of future biographers to unpick that and unravel that, and to say, while we respect that while people are still alive, it is not my job to soap that. It's not my job to pretend that things didn't happen that did happen, that were really painful and sad. At the same time, I think you should write sensitively about that. I'm not going to write, I was really worried about the Nazi past. I thought, oh my God, Barbara Pym's going to get cancelled. It's all going to be Paula Byrne's fault. I was absolutely terrified. And I got an offer from a big tabloid paper to write a big piece denouncing Barbara Pym, and I said, absolutely not, I'm not doing it. And it was like, oh yeah, Barbara Pym's a big Nazi. I said, I'm not doing it. I don't care what you pay me. I am absolutely not going to do this. It is not worth the money, and it's not fair. And I think that was never I never wanted to dig dirt. I never wanted to do that. But you have got a duty to tell the truth as you see it. And someone else will write another biography of Barbara Pym and say I was wrong, and that's fine.
I mean, there's so much to say about this that we can't say, but I mean, there have been so many books that document the naivete of people about the Nazi system. I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't a willful naivete, because there were other people at the same time who understood what was going on, but there are, I forget now the name of it, this wonderful book a few years ago about English travelers to the Third Reich.
Oh, it's brilliant. Yeah, it's Julia Barkas or Julia. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's just normal people traveling to the Third Reich. It's a wonderful book, and I recommend all of your listeners today. I think she's called Julia Barkas or Julia someone. It's definitely Julia, and SANM's going with B. And you're absolutely right, Bill. It's a brilliant, because it's just about how people were seduced by the Third Reich, and how. So, and again with that, it was pretty awful. But thousands and thousands, including Virginia Woolf and Leonard Woolf, were seduced by it when they went to Germany in the Third Reich before the war, thought it was absolutely wonderful.
Well, I mean, I think it's a very there's a large gap between the admiration for the Third Reich and for Hitler on the part of someone like the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, and then what Barbara Pym knows as a tourist. I mean, so I think it's very, it's almost like, oh, well, this tabloid wants to expose her as almost like a follower of Oswald Mosley and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor or something, in what they're absolutely to betray England, but that's
complete. And, you know, it's a very difficult one because that first version of Some Tame Gazelle, it is full of Nazi references. And I think Barbara was naive, and she fell in love with Freebird, and she fell in love with Germany. She was always in love with Germany, the beautiful poetry, the music, the countryside, as were many people, as explored in that Julia Barker's book.
Daniel has posted, it's called Travelers in the Third Reich by Julia Boyd.
Exactly, Julia Boyd, that's it, Julia Boyd.
So
thank you, Daniel.
Oh, no, we have time for one question. There's one more question, and I think I hope people are tolerating our going over. Michelle, I'm sorry, Michelle, I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name, Haniven. I hope I've pronounced it correctly. That she finds reading about Oxford, Barbara at Oxford, so painful, and how she puts up with such bad treatment for years from men. And she wonders, it's a large question, so I hope you can answer it somewhat briefly. What do you think set her up for a whole life of falling in love or falling for unavailable men, getting so obsessed with them, often within only a few hours of meeting them? And then she talks about, you know, that she was able to make art from the experiences, which perhaps redeemed it. But if you can know, she says, if we can ever know such things, where did this pattern of unrequited love come from?
Did Beth ask that question?
No, a woman named Michelle Haniven.
Michelle. Look, Michelle, you've asked the best question, and look, you know, that I could be here for another hour answering that. And you know, also, Michelle, I really wish I knew why that was, and I don't know, but I think, like many brilliant and genius writers, they want what they can't have. And I'm writing about Thomas Hardy and women the minute. It's a book about Hardy's women, and I think Thomas Hardy is not dissimilar. When you're a great romantic and you read Spenser and Shakespeare and Milton and all of the, you know, you fall more in love with being in love than the thing itself. And you're sort of setting yourself up for failure. It's a very brilliant question. And honestly, I wish I knew the answer, but I think she always went for the wrong men. She went for very gorgeous, attractive, clever, sometimes gay men. And I said the ultimate with Barbara Pym is she fell in love with gorgeous men who were out of her league. Then she fell in love with gay men who could never reciprocate. And then she fell in love with dead gay men. So she fell in love with Denton Walsh, who's one of my favorite, who Barbara Pym adored, because Denton was not only gay, he was dead. So I'm like, woohoo, you're getting full on here. You're getting dead and gay, brilliant. So, and it might sound frivolous, but it's not. It's actually that if you constantly fall in love with unavailable men, then you're the problem. You are actually the problem. So in a way, does that feed, like with Thomas Hardy, feed the work? Makes you miserable, but then you keep writing. And you know, there was a wonderful line in her diary when she says, what is better, being in love with Henry Harvey or writing? And she goes, writing. So, you know, my answer, Michelle, would be, at the end of the day, she'd rather be, like Jane Austen, a writer than to fall in love with men.
Right. That's a wonderful place to end on. I mean, both observing and respecting the conundrum, and still trying to think it through without venturing too far beyond what a biographer is able to know. So I want to thank Kim Wilson, and I want to thank Daniel Golden, Boswell, and also the Jane Austen Society for hosting us. And I loved your book, and I can't wait for other people to read it. And I hope that they get out of it as much as I did, and also that they go back, as I did after reading your biography, to the novels, which take on so many new aspects, and I saw so much new in them after reading the book. So thank you, Paula Byrne, for the book. And
Thank you. And do I have just time to thank everyone? I'm sorry we went a bit over, but can I just thank obviously Daniel, Bill, and Kim, and everyone who is here tonight. And honestly, I could be here for another 3 hours. You'd probably be bored stiff, but I could definitely be here for another 3 hours talking about it. But I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm thrilled that Barbara Pym is now published in the USA. And the reason why I wrote this book was because all I ever wanted to do was for more people to read Barbara Pym. End of story. And if that happens, then I'm a happy bunny. But I also want to say, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Bill, you were brilliant. Your questions were thoughtful. And I'll probably be thinking about them all night. Thanks a lot. You've ruined my night. But anyway,
think about your brilliant answers.
I've got a glass of wine. But thank you so much for having me, and just wonderful to speak to you, and God bless you all, and thank you so much.
No, I just want to say the Barbara Pym Society has a spring meeting, I think, in Cambridge every year. And I would like them to take up the question of why are all the Barbara Pym American packages so crapola? And can we get a nice looking, once again, treated like garbage. We want books that don't look like wallpaper. We want fabulous introductions. And are we going to have to wait for these books to go in public domain before we see this? I'm just throwing that out there.
But Daniel, do you know that Virago have just republished all the novels?
Of course I do. They look beautiful. They're not American.
They're not American.
I
take your point, and hopefully, that will change. I don't know.
There's 3 repackagings of the Pym. Like the last one was pretty good. The one before that was pretty good. You should look at how ugly the ones are in the United States. Oh my God. And they're also very hard to get. So I leave it.
What was the last word you said?
They're hard. They're not easy to get. The Morabelles were in and out of stock, but the coffee chat, they're kind of print on demand. Anyway, the Penguin kept excellent women. It's out of stock. It's like they're always out of stock. They disappear from the shelves. Anyway, thank you everybody. This was my dream event. Barbara Pym and I, little Barbara Pym and I, thank you.
Guys, I didn't know, but were there lots of nice questions? Because I couldn't see.
Lots of comments, lots of wonderful comments. People are very happy with this event. So are we, and we wouldn't have a bookstore without you. Hope to see you at another event. Looking forward to Bill's next book. Looking forward to Kim's next book. And you will not see a book from me. And also looking forward to your next book, Paula. But thank you all for coming.